Hello, everyone. My name is Jay Frost, and welcome to Frontlines of Social Good, where we bring you the latest news and insights from the world of philanthropy, fundraising, and social impact. I am here live at AFP Icon, or actually in a hotel room outside of where Icon is being held here in lovely Seattle, often beautiful but rainy. So it's a little dark in my space, but hopefully you'll forgive us that today. We have two bright and shiny guests to introduce to you in just a moment. But before we do that, of course, I want to welcome you and encourage you today to take part in the conversation. We have topics that will be of great interest to you and importance to your organizations and your work. So do make use of the chat and the Q&A as you see fit, and we would endeavor to make sure that your comments and questions are integrated into this conversation if you're here with us live. As usual, of course, today's show is packed with essential updates and inspiring conversations. But first, we'll take you through the top 5 gifts of the week, as we typically do. This is never an exhaustive list, but it's just a way of sort of gauging some of the big things that are coming across our desk. And in the future, if you have heard about gifts or received them that you think merit greater attention, we would love to cover those. So please do write to us with that information as well. So this week, we first turn to, let me see, $10 million from Lisa and Mark Schwartz to Northern Westchester Hospital to advance critical trauma services that are enhancing emergency preparedness and patient outcomes. That's $10 million. Next, also at $10 million, Kimberly Query to Northwestern University to launch the Query-Simpson Institute for Regenerative Engineering, focusing on innovative research in tissue and organ regeneration. Next, $11 million from the Arkansas Animal Rescue Foundation to Lyon College, apologies for any mispronunciations, at its School of Veterinary Medicine, supporting veterinary education and animal welfare initiatives. Next, $20 million from the family of Dr. Philip Needleman to the National Academy of Sciences to support the NAS Frontiers of Science program and a new initiative addressing national and global challenges through science. Next up, in the top one of the week that we have is $25 million from Shirley and Walter Wang to the UCLA Health to create the UCLA Center for Integrative Digestive Health and Wellness, combining traditional and integrative medicine in gastrointestinal care. In other news this week, Philanthropy News Digest reports that AmeriCorps has dismissed over 100 staff and canceled roughly $400 million in planned grants. You may have seen the effects of this already in your communities or with your organizations. The decision affects national service programs across the country, leaving many nonprofit partners scrambling. The agency cited internal challenges and budgetary constraints, but offered little transparency, prompting some backlash from organizations that had relied on funding for programmatic planning. Critics are arguing that this undermines public trust and risks long-term damage to the national service infrastructure. Grammy-winning singer and cellist, and in fact, multi-instrumentalist Leifei has announced the launch of the Leifei Foundation, aimed at expanding access to youth orchestras, an area that has been under some pressure in the last few years. The initiative will offer instruments, financial aid, and other support to under-resourced students interested in classical music. Leifei, who credits her own success to early music education, said she hopes to remove the financial barriers that often prevent young people from participating in orchestras. The foundation's first grants are expected to be awarded later this year. It's also interesting to note for those who follow the role of social media in not only advancing philanthropy, but also advancing careers of people who then might become philanthropists themselves, that Leifei took a great advantage of that in launching her career largely through some of these channels. Next, The Guardian reports that food banks across the U.S. are facing record demand, just as federal funding cuts gut their supply chains. A combination of pandemic-era relief rollbacks and inflation has created what some nonprofit leaders have called a perfect storm of need. In states like Texas and California, food banks report turning away families due to empty shelves. Advocates are calling for emergency congressional intervention to restore funding and prevent a worsening hunger crisis this summer. According to the nonprofit Times, the Trump administration has paused a series of proposed executive orders that nonprofit advocates had feared could restrict charitable speech and advocacy activities just this week. The measure is rumored to include new political activity disclosures and limits on 501c3 advocacy were reportedly shelved following pushback from nonprofit coalitions and legal experts. We've covered these issues in past editions of Frontlines, and those are all available for you on YouTube. Sector leaders have said that they remain watchful, urging the White House to engage the nonprofit community in any future regulatory planning. Something very new and fresh that in fact was debuted largely here at AFP in Seattle is the new news from the Fundraising Effectiveness Project. That information is also available to you online at the Fundraising Effectiveness Project website and directly through AFP. According to FEP, fundraising revenue rose by nearly 2% in 2024, driven almost entirely by large gifts. The newly released Q4 2024 fundraising report shows that gifts of over $5,000 increased significantly, even as the total number of donors continues to decline for the third year in a row. While fundraising totals have improved, donor retention continues, of course, to be a major challenge. Overall donor retention rates dropped to just under 43%, with the biggest losses among first-time donors. If you'd like to share what your experience has been with donor retention in the chat, we would encourage you to do that. This information is very helpful to all of us as we see benchmarks across our sector in different parts of it. The report once again emphasizes that long-term sector health will depend not just on large gifts, but on rebuilding relationships with everyday givers and finding new ways to re-engage lapsed supporters. Up next, we turn our attention to one of the most significant financial shifts in modern history, and certainly modern philanthropic history, and that's the estimated $100 trillion wealth transfer already underway across the generations. To help us unpack what this means for all of us, especially in the world of philanthropy and nonprofits and the next generation of donors, we're joined by Laura McDonald, principal and founder of Benefactor Group. You may know Laura's work already. If you don't, I strongly encourage you to follow it. Laura is a nationally respected voice in this field, past chair of the Giving USA Foundation. Is just one marker of that, and definitely a passionate advocate for values-based philanthropy, an author, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Laura, thank you very much for coming and sharing a little bit about kind of the update on this with us today.
My pleasure, Jay.
Where shall we begin? It might be helpful to get some kind of context here first. For those who aren't even aware of the wealth transfer, I know we've talked about it a lot, but it's also been kind of a moving needle over the decades about how much we're talking about, who we're talking about. Can you provide us a little bit of context?
Sure. I'll just throw some big numbers at folks, so be ready to write them down. But the estimate now, the updated estimate, is that those who were born prior to 1965, so baby boomers and older generations, have amassed a total of 123 trillion with a T, $123 trillion. It's the greatest concentration of wealth ever in the world, in the history of the world, it is believed. And a lot of this data comes from a research firm in Greenwich, Connecticut called Cerulli Associates. Some of it's available on their website. So $123 trillion today controlled by those born before 1965. And of that, then the assumption is that much of it will be transferred to the next generations. Now, some of it will be spent over their lifetime on healthcare, on consumer goods, et cetera. But consumption tends to decline as people age. So the thought is that about 105 trillion of that will transfer to younger generations, Gen X and younger. And about 18 trillion will go to nonprofit organizations in the form of charitable bequests and other kinds of planned gifts. And as I cited in the endowment handbook, if that $18 trillion were endowed, the draw, a 4.5% draw, would exceed total giving today. So the draw alone would exceed total giving today. But I think, a lot of people have begun to doubt whether this is really true. Is there such a thing? I'd love to hear from those who've joined us live today, what, if any, experience you're having with the great intergenerational transfer of wealth. If you are being inundated with, happily inundated with bequests, if you've seen nothing, if you've seen a little uptick. But I think the thing that Russell James would remind us is that if you're still waiting for this, some of the early prognostications that were based on typical life expectancy charts, for example, failed to take into consideration that wealthy people live longer. Generous wealthy people live longest of all. And we'll probably reach the peak of this in about 2040, which is the point at which half of the baby boomers will have attained age 85. And that's the average age at which bequests begin to pay out. So we're still at the front and rising tide of this transfer, but it is real. And as I say, $18 trillion could come directly to nonprofit organizations. Now, if you divided that equally amongst all the nonprofit organizations, everybody out there would get 10 or $12 million to add to their endowment, hopefully add to their endowment. I think that's the appropriate use of a bequest. But it won't be distributed evenly. It will be very lumpy. And you can't just wait with a catcher's mitt to get your share. You need to be out working and engaging those donors.
Right. There are at least three big questions right in there. I know that we're starting to get some comments. So thank you, Nicole, for warming up that space. And for anyone else who just wants to let us know you're here and maybe which part of the country or the world you're from, that's also helpful context. But Nicole is stating that at her organization, they're working on an event to honor the old guard of philanthropists in our area and all in their area, and also cultivating the next generation cohort of donors who can pick up the torch and continue the legacy of giving, which is interesting too, because even the language we use for all of this varies from place to place. If we were in Europe right now, we'd be talking about legacy giving, not planned giving. I wonder sometimes if maybe our language is a barrier itself. But I wanted to ask you about the 18 trillion. Where did that number come from? How do they estimate, or how do you and others estimate 18 trillion out of the 123?
The sources that I'm citing, the root source is this group in Connecticut that does research mostly for the wealth planning field. And so they update it annually. Then the New York Times picks it up. And so if you want to look for a secondary source, you can go to the New York Times article that came out in March of 23 and then again in March of 24 with the updated numbers. And I'm sure that they're using an econometric model that takes a look at the typical percentage of wills that include a charitable bequest and what the average amount of that charitable bequest is, and then begin to divide that by the $123 trillion that they believe will pass from older generations, which I hesitate to say because I'm now in that cohort, but those born before 1964 to younger generations into charity. So that's where it comes from.
Well, I know we're doing a bit of a reveal here, so I'll just say that I'm already thinking these issues too. I'm 62. There's no reason to hide these things. And so sometimes we think about this generationally, but you mentioned something else, which is that you didn't use the term moving target, but of course, some of these estimates have changed as there have been various factors, but one of them is an aging population, that we're just, wealthier people live longer. And
exactly. And generous, wealthy people live longest of all. I think that's a magical data point.
Yeah, it is. And I wonder if that's also, you're not there in Greenwich with them, but if that's also one of the thoughts behind, is it really one figure or is it another? Is they have to weigh the fact that the people who are the preponderance of this wealth we're talking about are the wealthier, and those people are living longer than ever before. Right. But they also, that would seem to suggest that if they've had children, that there are a larger group of people they might be distributing that wealth to. So that might have an impact on their charitable giving as well.
It could, the presence of children and especially grandchildren, because one would think that with these demographic trends that the children are going to live to the point where they have become independent, successful adults and perhaps rely less upon the older generation's bequests in order to navigate life. But families are getting smaller. We see that as well. And so I think that fuels the number. I think the original data was silent as to timing. And a lot of people got excited because they looked at typical actuarial tables, and then it took people like Russell James to remind us that no, these aren't typical populations. These are very atypical populations. And so when the tsunami didn't occur when some people might have expected it, that's when we realized that, hey, we need to look at this through the lens of giving and donor behavior and donor demographics. The other thing I would say is that we talk about generations, but really what we should be talking about is age. That, generational behavior shifts as that generation ages. So we should really be talking about people who have attained age X or Y more than generation X, Y, or Z. And the other thing, and I love the point that Nicole made, is that we think of this, oh, $123 trillion, but we're only getting 18 trillion of it. And the other 105 trillion is lost to us. No, it's not. It's going to the next generations who have also shown the green shoots of generosity in their giving behavior. And so the good work that she cites, working with next gen donors, makes a whole lot of sense to me.
Yes, and just to say, Joe also in the chat is talking about their effort to at her organization to create these initiatives or giving circles, which is another way to embrace many people in the community, but particularly this fourth generation group she talks about. And if we don't do that, I guess that begs the next question, which is, as you said, this isn't equally distributed. Otherwise, we'd all be sitting back waiting for our 12 million. But that's
Right.
not going to happen. And we heard just in the gifts that I list every week because I think it's fun. It's true, but all of those, almost all of those, are higher ed, and almost all of those are very large, and they're from very wealthy people. So
Yes.
there's not an equal distribution. We know that from Giving USA's work, but we also know that from the kind of work that you're citing, that this is not an equal distribution. So let me just ask the dumb questions. Why is that so? Why is it not equal?
Oh, I would say that's not a dumb question, but it might be ineffable. We'll try to unpack it some. So first, let's just look at the distribution of financial resources in our society today. It is as inequitable as it has ever been by many reports. And so the fact that the resources are distributed inequitably, I think, is a part of that. The other thing that I think is weighing on that is the fact that some sectors have been very aggressive and systematic in the way that they've engaged donors, higher ed, with having perfected the art of portfolio management, whereas other sectors perhaps have been more reliant on some fundraising tactics that worked really well with the greatest generation, but didn't, go find a millennial and ask them if they have a stamp, if they even know where to buy a stamp, or what to do with an envelope in order to put it in the mail stream.
No,
And
it's funny, but
so,
it's so true. I mean, very practical things. They're just totally different for different ages.
and some of it, I would say that what tends to vary are those transaction methods. So what are we doing to remove friction? And what are we doing to engage? I'd love to answer that question about DAF, so we'll come to that in a minute. But I do think that a constant is that, particularly when we talk about, we've talked about how important the hero story is in engaging donors and inspiring them to be generous. And there are all sorts of ways to tell the hero story. But when it comes to legacy giving or planned giving, what we run into is mortality aversion, that people don't like to think about their own demise. But the way to overcome that is through the perpetual hero story. You have a way to perpetuate these values that you've held so dear, and then add in social norming. People like you make planned gifts like this to organizations like ours. And I think those can really, regardless of generation, begin to break down. And so if we combine that with a frictionless giving experience, then I think we've got a fighting chance to have our organization inspire our fair share of donors.
And I would think that in theory, that those two pivots are ones that virtually every organization can make. They may not have a practical example from yesterday of someone who they can point to as a social norm example, but they may not have as many as Harvard, but they're going to have someone who has made a decision, right?
Absolutely. So if you've ever received a charitable bequest, that person is a hero. How do you hold them up as an example? If you're starting from scratch, this is one reason why we ask boards to lead.
Yeah.
Have you invited board members to include your organization as a beneficiary designation, which frankly can be a lot easier than including you in the will. Just make, part of your retirement portfolio, can you make us the beneficiary? You just have to log on to your portal probably to do that. which I know because I did it recently. So I think that there are ways to begin to have those good examples so that you can say with integrity, people like you make planned gifts like this to organizations.
That's such a great point, and I know you want to answer the staff question because it's important. It's material to these counts and many other issues, but I'm also interested in asking a question of those who are here present with us, if they're willing to answer, which is, do you have a will and have you named beneficiaries? Because for those of us in the field, one of the things that you're talking about with board members is not just the expectation, maybe that's the wrong word, but at least make an invitation to people who care about our causes enough that they're willing to attend meetings, go to events, probably financially support the organization today. But if we're not inviting them to do this thing that not only brings money to the organization in the future potentially, but also provides a tangible example of what leaders are willing to do before we go out and ask people who have not been invited to the table to participate. That's so important. But I wonder if maybe even at the staff level, that's something we should be thinking about as well. Not performatively, but because the act itself somehow changes the way we view things and therefore our conversations with others.
I could not agree with you more, Jay. And I even think of, that many employee benefit packages include some silly little $15,000 life insurance policy, which should not be the sole life insurance policy that somebody has, but they reach it and they're, going through their orientation and you have to name a beneficiary. And I don't know, I guess my spouse. So Karen is citing this as well. So that's great, Karen. But can you suggest gently that, and one of your options would be a charity of your choice, including us. So I think that's all very important. The other thing is that lest you be concerned or hear concerns from your board that, oh, we can't do that because then we're going to somehow cannibalize our annual support. If you want to increase annual giving, the best thing you can do is have an active planned giving program, because somebody who has made a provision in their estate for you to receive funding is more likely to give and give more annually. So if you want to grow your annual fundraising program, then build your legacy giving program.
And embedded in all this is that thing you talked about before about engagement, and that presupposes that we're actually inviting people to do these things, that we're providing examples of them, because if let's imagine again that the comparison might be to some university with 300 people in the development office. And yes, there are places like that. And then other places where they have no professional development staff. That doesn't necessarily limit them from communicating about these issues. So, but if we don't communicate, what happens? I'm going back to this equal distribution question. How much are we responsible for the fact that this is not equally distributed?
I think we do have to. I think we have to accept responsibility for a couple of things, including that. But by the way, I had lunch with Russell James a couple of weeks ago, and one of the things that his research is now showing is that many people who have bequest intentions in their estate, they might stop giving annual gifts about 3 years before they die. They may no longer have access to their own checkbook appropriately. Perhaps they're not doing, or they're forgetful, or it's more than they can manage at that stage of their life. So don't imagine that, oh, because they've stopped making their $2,500 a year annual gift, I guess we're not in the will anymore, we'll stop talking to them. That's the worst thing you could do. Just know that late in life, donor behavior could change, but you want to engage them. And I think the other thing is that we have seen many fundraising operations that have become what I call, somewhat pejoratively, big game hunter shops. And they're dismissive of those everyday donors. The people who are in the limelight are the transformational gift and principal gift and leadership gift officers, while the folks who are in the annual fund department are sort of have their career path is blunted. They don't have the same opportunities. And yet one of the things we know is that the most accurate indication that somebody has included an organization in their will is not the magnitude of their giving, but the loyalty of their giving. So Joe Bull has done some great research on this particular topic, taking a look at the magnitude of a bequest in comparison to annual giving, but the fact that the annual giving tended to be consistent. So I would be rolling through, and you don't need a fancy wealth screening program to look at your own data and say, who's given to us 7 of the last 10 years? Who's given to us, who started giving to us 20 or 25 years ago?
Right.
Those are our planned giving prospects.
There's so much more we can discuss, and I know we have limited time today. You've cited a couple of studies, including and individuals like Russell James, who's been in the series before, and we're all grateful to him. You have a lot of work here. Before we tackle a couple of these questions quickly, how can people learn more about what you're doing and keep following your work on this issue?
Well, I would say a couple of things. As you mentioned, Wiley published the endowment handbook back in November that I wrote, and there's a website. It's a fairly small website, but for the endowment handbook that you can go to, and it's got some resources, free downloadable resources that are available. And I would say that if you do choose to acquire the book, there's an annotated bibliography in the back that really talks about a lot of the resources. These are the things that I geek out on. Obviously LinkedIn and the firm's LinkedIn, Benefactor Group. For example, I published something a couple of weeks ago that many people have found helpful around asking, have we been here before? As we're looking at all the social and economic disruptions. And I think, as most economists would say, if you've seen one recession, you've seen one recession. If that's where we're headed, but with all of these disruptions. But I think we can learn things from how charitable giving has responded in the past to big disruptions like 9/11 or the Great Recession or economic headwinds. So I would say the Benefactor Group blog, which is often then posted to my LinkedIn profile, or the endowment handbook website.
Thank you.
Thanks,
And
Chris.
now let's see if we can tackle a couple of these. You mentioned about Christina's question. Do DAFs play any part in how this wealth transfer will play out? Do you have thoughts on that?
I do, and all of this is subject to the potential for some regulatory changes to occur in the DAF field. I've got an opinion on that too, but I won't go into it right now. So I think the real opportunity for all of these organizations is to really, if they've got donors who give consistently through a donor advised fund, ask them what the successor clause is on that donor advised fund. When they created it, whether it's with one of the national donor advised fund sponsors or with their local community foundation, which is where my two DAFs are. So what was your successor clause? Again, they were sitting in some conference room somewhere and they had to fill out this line. And so they had to figure out what to say. Sorry about that. And so I would say that would you consider naming us as the successor? Should there still be any funds available after your lifetime? So that's one, but the other is that most of them will name the next generation in the successor clause. And so those are some of the assets that will be passing from one generation to the next, even though they're no longer. And they probably aren't included in that $123 trillion because technically they're no longer the assets of that individual. They're on the balance sheet of the donor advised fund sponsor. But I think that's a real area of opportunity.
And we're talking about a lot of money. What is the current estimate of the total in DAFs?
I'm going to misspeak if I even guess, but was it something like 6 billion?
Yeah, well,
probably more than that. No, Fidelity alone is probably that. So
right.
I think
it's huge.
It's dozens of billions of dollars,
right.
And so there's big opportunity there.
Right. And just one note, it's kind of outside the scope of this conversation, but I know that because both of us like data, are probably fascinated by this. I was talking to someone just a few days ago about the crowdfunding platforms. And I know just one of those is talking around in the range of $40 billion. And that is probably not all being counted by Giving USA, which both of us, really respect that work. I mean, it's not to take anything away. It just wasn't part of necessarily the fabric or easily accessible. So
well, what's counted in Giving USA is any of that money that's going to a 501c3.
Right.
So that's the lane for Giving USA this is the charitable giving behavior of 501c3s, and so some of it is counted, but if it's an act of generosity going from an individual to another individual, which is wonderful.
And very common now because of these
very common, then it's not counted. And so the 2023 numbers, the most recent year we have of $577 billion, 577 billion, includes some of that 40 billion, but not all.
And then finally here, a question from Jose, who had said this advice, like, as you just said, people like you make gifts to organizations like ours applies well to existing planned giving programs at established nonprofits. But what about for organizations such as a university's C3 student union, barely standing up a development department with no planned giving program? And Jose, I would say that that might be true for many kinds of organizations with virtually no development team. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, look for there are some great resources out there that are available at a reasonable cost, including the good old fashioned Leave a Legacy program. You know, it's still out there. Go to the Charitable Gift Planners website, and they still have those Leave a Legacy resources that might be available to you. I would say partnering with, if you're part of a big university, have you talked to the development office there and, you know, made sure that they've got some resources, including a plan giving officer? If that's not a great partnership for you, have you talked to your local community foundation about the resources that they have to offer?
Mm-hmm.
And then, as we said, if you want to be able to say with integrity, people like you make gifts like this to us, start, Jose, have you made a gift as a part of your designation of your retirement assets or your will? What about other staff members? Or do you have a board or an advisory committee, and have any of them done it? So I think, you know, yes, you start small and you have to build from there.
Right. And just an admission, I'm in the process of setting up a DAF myself. I haven't done it yet, but I'm just doing it at this point in my life. So we all come to this when it's right for us. But the experience itself, I think, does inform then how we think about these things, because we will have gone through it ourselves. Thank you so much for all of this, Laura. Really do appreciate it, and all your work, and for spending some time with us today.
Good. It's always fun to have a conversation with you, Jay. I'm happy to do it.
Until next time.
Indeed.
And now we're going to shift gears a little bit, although I do think it's complementary, as these things typically are. We're going to turn our attention to a conversation with Chris Van Bergen. I'm holding up his book here. I hope you can see it. His book, which is Certifiable, How Businesses Operationalize Responsible Sourcing. If that doesn't sound like the language we typically use in this space, well, I would say this, maybe it should be. Chris not only has been one of the key figures behind his organization, but also someone who's been recently in our podcast. We've discussed his work in growing his organization over the last, well, I'm trying to remember how many years. I think it's 13 years plus. So the real questions here are, you know, how can we make sure that we're learning the best we can from, I think, from businesses in this case, if we're thinking businesses aren't nonprofits, although they are, but also maybe vice versa. How can we make sure that our heart is in the way we operationalize? Chris is the co-author of, again, this book, Certifiable, a guidebook for companies serious about ethics and accountability in complex systems, both of which are really important in our sector. He's also, of course, as I just alluded to, the COO of Nest, which helps build pioneering programs to improve labor practices and trace supply chains back to the source. Chances are that you've probably run into products from or through, have made their way to you or members of your community through Nest. So if you don't know Nest's work, I would encourage you to check that out afterwards today. Chris is joining us now to talk about how nonprofits can learn from the private sector and maybe vice versa when it comes to operational integrity and how to turn good intentions into verifiable impact, among other things. Chris, thanks so much for talking today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. I love the first half of the show. I learned, actually just taking a bunch of notes myself, so it was great.
Yeah, Laura is great, and she's able to, you know, make her way through all this data in a very rich and complicated way, but also translate it for those of us who don't have that background. And I know you're doing that too. So we don't have to go over too much of your background, because I hope people will listen to the conversation we had. But can you give people just a thumbnail sketch on maybe what you're doing today, as well as what inspired this book?
Sure, absolutely. So I'll try and keep it brief so we can really dive into some stuff.
Sure.
Nest, we're almost 20. We'll be 20 in the fall. And we are a nonprofit based here in the United States. We operate globally. We work in the handcraft sector, so artisans and home-based businesses, both in the US and abroad. And we do a wide variety of things. We've had many iterations over the many years, but essentially you can think of us, on the one side, we operate like a very traditional nonprofit. We raise the philanthropy, corporate foundations, individual giving. to drive programs directly serving those artisan businesses. We reach businesses across over 120 countries through business acumen trainings and supports, things like that. And then on the other side of our business, which is really kind of where the meat of the book comes into play, we partner with a ton of brands and retailers who are trying to figure out how to responsibly source product. Our supply chain looks very different than a traditional supply chain. So we're dealing with home workers and small workshop producers as opposed to a traditional factory production. And so the brands need a lot of help. And we came into this space, again, we never founded Nest thinking we were going to go into supply chain transparency. Let's be honest. That wasn't our core mission, right? But what we found was that we actually needed to engage the business sector in a much stronger way in order to meet our mission. And what I mean by that is we were doing all this amazing training and business acumen development for these artisan businesses. And we had brands come to us and say, yeah, I love the product. I'm never going to source it. We said, why? That's horrible, right? I mean, that defeats the entire purpose. And they said, because there's too much risk. We don't know where it's coming from. There's no transparency. My goodness, are there children involved? Are people getting paid? Is it safe? And so it was a huge wake up call for us, actually, because again, at that point, we were really fully philanthropically supported by and large. And today our model is really about 30%, depends on the year, 30, maybe 40% is more kind of fee for service work related to the supply chain transparency work. And so we put in the work and we built out this whole system to reach this type of supply chain, which had never been really thought of before. Everyone was thinking about the risks at factories, and chances are the product, even if it ends up in a factory, started somewhere else. And so that's the part of the supply chain we work on. We got a whole industry collaborative effort going and have a ton of industry partnerships who are really helping us with this work. So that's kind of in a nutshell what we're doing. And then on the other side of in all my spare time, of which I have very little, I teach. I teach around social responsibility in business. I got a degree from Stern at NYU, and I've been teaching there for a number of years. And the book kind of came out of that effort, came out of this, I was having all these conversations with people in business school and with friends and relatives and consumers, and then the folks that are in the businesses. And it seemed like there was a missing piece here in terms of how you actually get the work done. And what does it mean when you buy something that has some sort of seal on it? What went behind that seal? What does that mean exactly? And so that was really the origin story for writing the book.
And this whole idea about this seal of approval, and I think about good housekeeping because of my age. I don't know if that exists anymore. I mean, the magazine does, but I don't know if they have a seal of approval anymore. Or Better Business Bureau, I suppose, is another one. But I don't know how much of that translates in the minds of many people in the impact sector. But you're living it every day. So again, going back to the work at Nest for a second, how are you able to help people who might think of charitable organizations as being somehow completely, not divorced from, but separate and apart from this world of being able to say, this is good, and these are the reasons why, and these are the 12 points you need to be able to certify in order to be someone that we're willing to work with. Have you had people kind of brush up against that, even at Stern, let's say students who said, but no, that's not us, that's not our culture?
Yeah, it's interesting because what we find often when businesses approach us, they actually want somebody who's an objective third party who's really focused on the impact and the mission and doesn't have necessarily a business stake in, say, the transaction between that big box retailer and the people producing baskets in the Philippines, for example. And so what we find is that the NGO space and nonprofits play this very critical role as this gatherer of either industry folks that might be competitors with each other, but to come together and tackle a collective issue, a collective problem, as well as working with the producer businesses on the other side of the globe, or frankly, in their garages here in the United States, to really bring both sides together. Say, okay, act as that moderator, as that mediator, and remind everybody of the impact and the place where we're trying to go. There are going to be trade-offs on both sides. There just are. I mean, in this relationship, right? I mean, you have to give something. You have to have more patience as a brand as the producer business figures it out. The producer business needs to kind of get on board with this idea that all of a sudden I need to keep proper records and I need to show who my employees are and all this sort of. So there's work done on both sides, and Nest and organizations like ours kind of sit in the center of that and really are that objective third party. And that's really what we find. When it comes to the business school conversation, I think if not careful, business folks will just tune out once they hear that you're a nonprofit. And you kind of indicated
when you say that, they hear like,
they said,
no
oh,
profit.
You're just like a bleeding heart liberal. You don't really know anything about business, right?
Uh-huh.
And the fact is, and you alluded to it before, like nonprofits, first of all, I hate that title. It makes zero sense because like we're not nonprofit. You can make a profit as a nonprofit business, right? So this is where I have to start in those conversations, is that it's not about not making money or not thinking with a business mindset. It's about equity structure, essentially, right? It's like,
Okay.
Rebecca, my wife, founded Nest, and we've been working together for 15 of those 20 years. If we both decided to walk away, we can't sell Nest to, that's our exit plan. That's not the way it works. Or if Nest has a good year, that doesn't mean that like we get a bigger payout. The money goes back to Nest, and it's really about focusing on the mission as opposed to the service of your for-profit shareholder. And so once they kind of realize that, it's like, oh, you do have to think through business strategy and competition, and you can build a budget and you can break even. You can build a budget and you can run a deficit. I mean, that's okay, but you need to be thinking about what is the business strategy behind the offerings that you have, whether that's meaning that they resonate better with your donor population. So, because as we all know, donors are asking different questions now than maybe they were 25 years ago. And now it really is, what is the social return on my investment? They really are thinking about it from an investor mindset in many, many, many ways. At least that's what we're finding at Nest. In addition to the fact that we are now navigating contracts with big multi-billion-dollar corporations who obviously have their own strategy and are trying to do what they're trying to do. And we need to get paid for that work. And so that's really kind of the conversation that I often start with at a business school level, is that one. It's like, yes, we're a nonprofit, but that doesn't mean that we don't know what we're doing. And so that's really where it starts.
As you were talking about this, I remembered one of the many conversations here at AFP. There's a big focus on storytelling in this world, and it makes sense because we tell stories to communicate many things. But one of the things about telling a story that's not necessarily related to how we carry out the work, but its impact, is that sometimes then we aren't able to provide that proof. We might have a social proof, the child is fed, or the community has power, or there's water that made its way to the village, or whatever the thing is. There's scholarships for the students, but the pieces that you're talking about in certifiable, or you just described, they may be absent. And I'm wondering if for the donors who are like you're saying, they're looking for an evidence-based approach to, how can you show that this is going to succeed at the investment level? I'm going to give you the money in advance of what you propose to do. And then how are you going to measure the success afterwards to know if we're going to go to the next series of financing, essentially? That conversation is also complex. If we're so focused on the story about how we help the child, which is a beautiful thing, how are we going to also make sure that we have both the internal structures to certify that our work is being done properly, and also we can provide that evidence to people who might potentially invest?
Yeah, great question. I think you're spot on there, honestly. And that's, whether it's the work that Nest does or whether it's the work that any of the nonprofits on the call do, what we find is that when we're standing up a new program, and this compliance-based program was very much a new program for us, as I indicated, we needed to think through what those steps were going to look like and what the financial viability plan was going to be over the long term. It's like, yes, we got philanthropic capital up front to launch this effort, right? But then for us, and frankly, that's how we delved into this fee-for-service approach with brands. Like, we have the philanthropy to build the solution, right? And to pilot it out and do all the things. And we have all these brands that are engaged in the work because it's important for them, because they're doing it for two reasons. One, from a risk mitigation perspective, and the other from a storytelling perspective. Actually, they wanted to be able to really blast out the fact that this is artisan-made product and it's responsibly sourced, and here are all the reasons why, and here are the beautiful images and testimonials of the people that just made that basket that you just bought.
Right.
So for those two reasons, competitive advantage and risk mitigation. But we needed, as an organization, to be responsible stewards of the funds that we received, not only build a program, but what is, a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, how do we need to build out the team that's going to be able to execute on this program and really then drive it forward? And what does lasting change look like? What are the KPIs that we need to be demonstrating to say, yes, we went into this business, and we learned a ton from our pilots. The first thing was, in a traditional compliance program, the first thing you do is you do an assessment. Like they call it an audit, we call it an assessment of that factory producer. And then you identify what the weak points are, and then you have a remediation strategy, and you get a scorecard, and blah, 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 right? Our pilot programs, we ran out, and what we found was that nobody had anything. And so it's like, remediation strategy, we need to have everything built, right? So you basically scored a 0 on this entire assessment. And it's not because you're not operating ethically, it's because you have no way of proving that you were operating ethically. You didn't have the records in place. You didn't have the written policies. You didn't have the training programs. Were terrible things happening? No, they weren't. Did you have a risk of terrible things happening? You absolutely did, because you didn't have these monitoring systems in place. And so we wound up pivoting our system to be a training first approach, and then working with those businesses for the better part of a year before we even talk about an assessment. And so I say all that because it came back to the KPIs. We wanted to see, business wage setting indicators at the start of the program, wage setting indicators once they have their first assessment, their second assessment, third assessment. And that's only one of the many KPIs that we look at. And we were able to show our funders, our brands, everybody, look, at the start of the program, very few, maybe it was 40%, had any sort of wage setting practice in place, which meant that most of those artisans were not making a minimum wage. Okay. And it wasn't because they didn't mean it. It was just, well, the basket's always been $10 in this village. Why should we think about anything else? Right. So training them how you have to think about, well, how long did the basket take to make? And, how you're compensating for that time and all those sorts of things. And then at the end of the program, it was closer to 70% after that first year had wage setting indicators in place. And then it just goes from there. So you're able to quickly prove out the efficacy of the work and to demonstrate, oh, if I am involved in this program, which is going to take effort and it is going to take some capital, this is what I can then show to my internal team, to any regulators, and to our consumers, right?
Wow, one of the dangers of not scripting these questions and just asking you these random things isn't your answers, which are terrific, but it's that they take me in some unusual directions. So you just talked about something that makes so much sense about wage setting as a way of both operating the business and ensuring against disaster, but also to be ethical and aligned with your values. So the organization can say that we're right. And it doesn't matter if we're doing that because we're trying to get a profit or because we want a positive fund balance, the nonprofit terminology for having a good balance sheet. But this happens not just with handcrafts or working with people in developing countries who are making a basket. This is happening on campuses. So, adjunct faculty members and what they earn versus people who are on tenure track, or TAs at universities or colleges who are trying to pay for school and get an education, and what they earn, which can be pretty terrifying as I understand it. Or we think about unpaid interns and nonprofits. I don't mean to take everybody to task. This is really a roundabout way of saying, do we need to be thinking about these things in our own context? So it's not just where we're getting the ties for Save the Children, which is a wonderful organization, I support them, but also what are we doing with our own staff, our own volunteers? How are we recognizing them? How are we measuring those things? And how are we properly compensating so it's aligned with our values and our mission?
Yeah, and that's the blessing and the curse of work like this, because, and I'll tell you, I mean, we as an organization had to look in the mirror and say, we're telling all these businesses they need to do this thing. We have to make sure we're doing this too, like how are we ensuring the health and well-being of our employee base as an organization? And is that aligned with our values? Is it aligned with what we're trying to do elsewhere? And so making sure that you take care of your people, it's absolutely critical.
I know that when a for-profit entity is seeking additional financing, whether that's debt or whether it's investment capital of any form, they're going to be providing a balance sheet. They're going to be providing a profit and loss statement and projections for the next several years, as well as evidence of their past activity and and it has to be pretty good. Is that kind of information, do you think, as critical for charitable organizations, or even if people aren't currently requesting it? Is it valuable to do that for internal processes, and maybe even for donors who might want to get a sense about where you're going in the future?
Yeah, great question. I think I'll answer it in two different ways. I think for projects that have the opportunity to become very large projects and very kind of mission aligned and mission focused projects, I think a targeted plan based on that project is required. And we do that at Nest. We do project based budgeting. There's a threshold, obviously, because you can't really do it for every single thing, but we do project based budgeting, thinking about the staff time, thinking about external costs, thinking about all the things, thinking about the funders we have now, funders we might need to get in the future. If we like, what's the scale play? So we do that as an organization. In addition, I think what is critical for donors, given the volatility of the time, not that dissimilar to the volatility of COVID, perhaps from a market-based perspective and disruption, is being very forthcoming as far as risk planning. And so what we do at Nest is we have our operating budget like everybody does. And then in addition to that, we have layers of risk scenarios, in terms of, this long-standing funders, like we have an agreement for X dollars per year, but what if that brand, for instance, gets into difficulty? They're going to have to walk that back. Do we need to then dial back our projections in terms of the revenue that we were going to get this year? A little different if you have multi-year grant agreements, because those are a little bit harder to walk back, but not impossible. But for us, it's really more around the unidentified tranches of revenue and where those are coming from, and what those then would inform in terms of the potential work that we want to do as an organization. And that's something that's been an ongoing conversation for us for quite some time, more so now than ever, but making sure that as an organization, you're monitoring your risk. And are there places where you have a portfolio of work that's growing and is a revenue driver? And are there places you have a portfolio that's a cost center? And is that okay? And it can be okay, right? You can have that conversation and say, yes, this is mission critical for us. We need this program. Not quite getting the revenue we need from it now, but this one over here, we're actually getting maybe more than we need. Particularly, if it's a fee for service work, it's not quite the same as restricted funds and things like that. Can some of that revenue then drive that other important work that isn't getting the attention from donors that we really want it to? And so it provides a little bit more flexibility in that regard. I don't know if that answered your question, but
yeah, no, it does. I mean, there's so much complexity to this, and I guess that at least for me, that demonstrates why it's really important to think through these things, but also to demonstrate them, at least in the data that we maintain about our organizations, and be able to constantly look back and say, did we meet these objectives or not? Whether that's a specific, very specific financial one, or something else, like you've talked about in the book, and you do at Nest, where it's a matter of we got this activity or this product from this place, and did it meet our expectations? Did it meet our values as well? I do want to ask you, in terms of nonprofits writ large, how can they start to think about building systems of accountability, especially if they don't feel, and we saw this in the last conversation about planned giving, for example, if they don't feel they have the infrastructure or the resources that a major corporation or even maybe a major university might? How can they start to build those systems of accountability?
Yeah, great question. I think, and I say this a lot, which is sort of a funny phrase that a artist and business leader who I adore dearly from India told me once when I was in their office helping them work through a problem. They said, first of all, you can't eat the whole elephant all at once. And you just need to and it was like, oh, that's really, I love it. I love the analogy. You need to identify what those problems or ideas are, and have kind of small steps towards those. Don't try and wrap your arm around a very large problem all at once. And so that's number one, and essentially prioritize, right? Like, think about, as an organization, what areas do we want to do better? What areas do we feel like are opportunities for us from an impact perspective, from a market perspective? What are our stakeholders needing? Because stakeholders might need something very different now than they did maybe 3 months ago. And how can we react to those changes? And so really thinking about what those pieces are, instead of trying to do all of it, because that'll really break your organization and your staff and you. So I think that's a big piece of it. I think also looking at what other maybe larger organizations are doing and doing well, and seeing what can you take from that and do, even if it's just at a smaller scale, like a little bit. Oh, like their strategy is this thing over here, or it looks like it is. How does that translate to what we do? And can we do that? You know, we don't have a team of 55 people doing that one thing in that portfolio. We have maybe 3 people in this portfolio. We're either approaching that work over there, or we could maybe add to what we're doing here. And I think that's a big piece of it too. And just sort of thinking about kind of smaller scale, small shifts and changes that you can do while always being resilient as an organization. I mean, you know, if the times are a bit troubling for some folks, loss of funding and et cetera, first thing to do is just make sure you keep the train on the tracks. Don't massively try and disrupt your whole business model unless that's the only way you can keep going. And so I think that's obviously critical. I do see folks sometimes make the mistake of getting so laser focused on this new thing that they forget to think about their business model, right? You have to do both in parallel. And so I think that's the kind of important advice. Yeah, force through the trees, exactly.
And okay, this is the tough one. This is the prognostication question. People hate these because how can you possibly know? But you've thought about this a lot. And I'm wondering, this is something I think about when I hear National Public Radio and they say something about a company and they say certified by Chev. I still don't know what Chev is. I should know that, but I don't. And there are other examples of things like that too. Do you imagine, given our current environment and the pressures on the third sector, on the impact sector, call it what you will, that at some point we may need to have the equivalent where people say that our organization is certified and that speaks to the seal of approval so that donors and government and others can say, yeah, I know that they have a plan. They have, something that's executable. They measure against it, and they are transparent.
Wow, I love the question. I do. I love it, and I can absolutely see the appeal of a system like that because there are so many opportunities out there. And if I'm a donor and I don't really know where to go, and I vaguely know what I want to support, I still have maybe 50 options of organizations that I can look at, and then how do I then get that information? I think it could be very interesting. I think it would be challenging. And I think the challenging part is to get everyone on the same page as far as what would be involved in that seal, right? Our conversation at Nest with the seal that we do have on products was easier because all of the industry could collaborate and they all knew it's like, yeah, like no child labor. That's kind of an easy one. You know, like it wasn't that simple, but it was easier to get people around the table and to agree. And I think this piece, particularly if you're thinking about impact, then like, what is it? Is it impact per dollar? Is it like, how do you measure what success looks like from a nonprofit perspective? Can be incredibly challenging. And as we know, it's small nonprofits have different challenges than big nonprofits. They both have challenges. You know, they both use money slightly differently. You can say small one's great because they bootstrap, right? Big one's great because they have broader reach, but maybe they use the money and it's distributed amongst administrative costs differently. I don't know. But I love the idea. I wouldn't want to be the one who's in charge of that program. that seems like a hornet's nest.
I wouldn't either, but I still had to ask. This is the book, certifiable. It's with Wiley.
It is with Wiley. Yeah, 2 Wiley publishers on the same call. I love it.
So you definitely want to. Wiley produces great books that speak to broader issues and very specific issues in our sector. You can get the book. Chris, how can people follow the rest of the work, including at Nest?
Yeah, our website has a ton of information. So it's buildanest.org. We're not Nest, the thermostat company. We are completely separate from them. Yeah, buildanest.org. We have, we have our own blogs and all sorts of stuff. We have a LinkedIn page. You can follow me on LinkedIn as well. And that's probably the best way to keep in touch.
Thank you very much for doing this, Chris. Really appreciate it. And
thank you, Jay.
If you want to hear more about Chris's work and his life, his work with his spouse, Rebecca, and building the organization, you can do all that at the PM Podcast. And that brings me to the last little item here, which is that coming up across the Philanthropy Mastermind series, we have this Thursday, Sabrina Walker Hernandez, who's also been the podcast telling her personal story. But this week, she's joining us with one of our CFRE accredited sessions to talk about the 7 steps to building $1 million board, even if you're starting small. You'll get a behind the scenes look at the framework from Sabrina's forthcoming book and walk away with a practical roadmap for transforming your board into a confident, connected, and committed fundraising force. And then once again, I just mentioned the PM podcast. That's our more personal view of the lives of people who are in the impact sector, their journeys. You can hear the latest edition of that, crossing my fingers, this Friday night. The reason I'm crossing my fingers is I just conducted 6 interviews with all the AFP honorees this year. The outstanding fundraiser, the 2 youth fundraisers, the person who won the Skystone Ryan Award, a name that should be familiar to you, Dr. Jen Shang, who's the world's leader on philanthropic psychology, and a conversation all about love. So you'll want to listen to that. And with the 2 young philanthropists, including one who actually played us a tune right there in the exchange. So you want to check out all of that. It's a lot of fun. Those will be coming to you over the next 6 episodes starting this Friday. And then finally, next Tuesday on this show, Frontlines of Social Good, we will return with a critical conversation on where are the boards defending institutional independence, where we will be joined by Dr. Raquel Rawl and Dr. Dimitri Morgan, respectively, of the UC system and the University of Michigan, talking about that issue, as well as being joined by an old friend who's been so important to the sector, Derek Feldman. And so you'll check out all of that by simply going and registering for these sessions on the website of our extraordinarily generous sponsor, DonorSearch, who has been sponsoring this series since 2016. This is year 10. We're so grateful to them. And they're doing it still. You can find much of our content, at least for the last 2 years, on their website at DonorSearch.net. You can find us on their YouTube channel, where a recording of this will be. And of course, you can check out their work to understand your donors when you're there. So I hope you'll do that as well. Thank you very much for being here today and spending time with us. We look forward to seeing you next time on the Frontlines of Social Good. Until then, take care. Bye, everybody.